Okay, so today's demos, we're gonna do a bar chart, a very basic bar chart. So your first D3 visualization. We'll do a slightly fancier version of a bar chart, make it look a little bit nicer. And then we'll do a scatter plot. And that scatter plot will actually have some interactions in there so you can update it based on, if the user does some interaction on the page, like say changes a drop-down box, the scatter plot will react to that. Okay, so in the GitHub on the lectures code, we have the code base for today. And so we've got a bar HTML, a fancy bar HTML, and a scatter HTML are the HTML files we're going to look at. For the bar chart, we're going to be using this data set called population by country 2020 CSV. Okay, so a key part of data visualization is data, right? So we need a data set to visualize. So, so this data set, I found it on online. It shows demographic and other kind of indicator type of attributes for different countries in the world. Okay, so if you think back to our lectures, what type of data set does this look like? Tabular, yes, right? It's a table. It's a CSV file or an Excel file or like a SQL database, right? So each row is a data point in the database, right? We have China, India, US, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, right? So it's probably been sorted based on like population, right? In decreasing order. And each column would be an attribute, right? And so columns can either be, or attributes can either be categorical or quantitative. So like country, right? Country would be a categorical attribute, right? China, India, US, right? These are different, it's either the same or it's different, right? It's different categories. They're also using country as kind of an index here, right? There's only one country data point in the data set. You don't see like duplicates for Brazil or US or so on. Right, and then there's a bunch of other data points like population, 2020, yearly change, net, right? A bunch of other stuff. We're gonna look at the population data value or data attribute. And so you can see that this looks like a numeric attribute, right? So it's the population, the number of people that live in a country. But there's some other types of there's some other types of data points in this data set. Right? So you might see that there's 1.30 space percent sign. Right? So we might interpret that as a number, but when we parse that, we might have to do a little bit of data handling to convert it from this kind of percent, right? JavaScript will probably see that and say, oh, there's numbers and then there's also non-numeric things. So it'll convert that into a string. So we might, if we want to use a value like that, or if you're using values like this in your homeworks, right, we'll just need to convert those properly. Okay, so let's get into the HTML file a little bit. And so the way this is going to work, all the code should be there. We're just going to go through and uncomment it as we go along. All right, so let me scoot that over. Okay. And so I've opened this, our first bar chart file using the live server plugin in the right-hand Chrome window. Okay, and so starting out, it's a very simple file, right? There's just a rectangle here. That rectangle is an SVG, right? And so if we open up the dev tools, right, we can see there's the body, right, which is right here. There's our SVG called bar chart SVG. And then there's a head section up here, right? So in the HTML code, we have a title. We import D3 with this script tag. We have a little bit of CSS here. So right? We have some CSS for the SVG, right? So we give it a width, we give it a height, and we give it a border. And so that's what this rectangle here in the Chrome is, right? So the width is 600 pixels, the height is 400 pixels, and we have a gray border that goes around it. And then a couple others, we have two other CSS here. One says for any rectangle element, right? So RECT, rect, is an SVG specific HTML element. So we're going to set a color for that. And we also have a label that says dot axis label right here. And what that's going to say is any class called axis dash label, right? That's the dot, means we look for classes. We'll just adjust the CSS a little bit. So font size, we'll make the font size a little bit larger. This 1.2 EM says make it 1.2 times larger than whatever the default is. So whatever the page defaults to, we'll make it a little bit bigger. And instead of using like a Times New Roman font, we're going to we'll just change it to like a Arial, a sans serif font. Because I think those look a little bit nicer. Okay. All right, so that's how we're starting off. So let's go into the this script tag here. So you see there's this big long script block, right? So it's real long, all the way down here. Right, and all this code's been commented out. So this is the code that we're going to use to create our bar chart. Okay. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a reference to our SVG element. And we're also going to get its width and its height. Okay, so we can say const SVG. So this is a JavaScript line. So this says, let's make a constant variable, right? So just like in other languages, I can't change the value of this variable. If I want to have a variable that I can change, the keyword I need to use is var, var. I can also use a keyword called let. So let and var are similar. They have different scoping. So one is global, one is locally scoped. But that's how I do a dynamic variable. So we'll just say const because we're not going to change our reference to this SVG. We say D3 select # bar chart SVG. So what D3 is going to do is it's going to look in the document object model. It's going to look in here. And it's going to look in the DOM. And it's going to find an element with the ID bar chart SVG. And so now we have a reference to that in JavaScript. And then we're going to read we're going to get the width and the height. So the 600 and the 400. Okay. Now this is kind of a complex line. So what are we doing here? So the first thing we do is we say SVG dot style width. That is going to read, it's going to say, okay, so in my SVG element, look for a CSS style called width and get the value. So that's what that's doing right there. And now because we have a width style property, right, that'll return this right here, 600px. That's going to be a string. Okay, so we say get that. So this is like 600px, and then we're just going to do a string replace px with an empty string. Okay, so that'll remove, right? It'll go from 600px to 600, and then there's a plus sign here. Does anyone know what the plus sign does? The plus sign is that's going to cast it from a string to a number. Okay, so sometimes if you're trying to plot data using D3, and right, let's say I'm trying to plot the number 100, right, at like 100x, the position of a point. If it's messing up, if it's plotting like way over here or like off the screen somewhere, It could be because you're trying to plot strings and not numbers. Okay, so in JavaScript, you need to cast the values to a number before we plot them. So we do this here, so we're actually reading the width as a number and not a string, right? So if we try to add something to it, it'll actually do the arithmetic. Okay, so we get the width and we get the height, and again, we'll just save those as constant variables because we're not going to change the size of our SVG drawing space. Okay, next. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create some more variables, margin. So margin is used for adding kind of space or padding around the bar chart. So if you go look at like online examples of D3, this is really common. Okay, and basically what it's going to do is, if you remember, when you draw inside of an SVG space, where's the 0, 0 point inside of an SVG? Yeah, top left. Yeah, so top left is your 0, 0. So what this margin is going to do is it's going to say, okay, we're going to change that 0, 0 point to 20 pixels off the top. So we're going to go down 20, and we're going to go left 160 pixels. Okay. Now, if we try to do something like, if we try to draw a chart that's 600 pixels wide, right, and we've shifted down 20 and shifted, right, if we've got 160 pixels on the left of space, right, we need to shrink the size of our chart. Otherwise, it's going to go outside of the SVG. So we also have this, we have a right margin and a bottom margin, right? So we need to shrink it even more. And then we'll get in what we call an inner width and an inner height. So this is kind of like the working size of our chart, right? Our chart will be drawn inside this, whatever the width minus the left and right margins, and then the height will be the height minus the top and bottom margins. Okay. Now, this right here is a JavaScript object. Right, so you see I say margin equals open bracket, and I have top 20, bottom 90, right 20, left 160. Okay. So if I did something like console.log margin, okay, save that. And if I go look in my DevTools, I can look at the JavaScript console. And you can see that I print out the object right here. Okay, so this is a JavaScript object. You can think of it like a hash map or a map, right? A hash map, a map. An object is composed of keys or attributes and values. Okay, so that's basically a JavaScript object. And so you can see that I've got my 4 keys, top, bottom, right, and left, and they show up inside the object, and then the values are right there. Okay. Now these values are stored as numbers, right? And I could do something like, let's say I put quotes around 160. If I save this and reload the page, right, now you notice that left, it's actually stored as a string. Okay, so if I was trying to do arithmetic on a string, right, JavaScript is it's not gonna be like I want to do it. So it's important to kind of know, like, how am I storing my numbers? Are they numbers or strings? I could also store an object in here. Like I could say something like, I don't know, og equals, right? Not left, but maybe like x equals 10, y equals 20. So I could say something like that. Right, so it's just key values. The value could be another object. And so this is very similar to JSON files. If you've ever worked with JSON, it's very similar to that. I could store a list in here or an array, more objects, numbers, strings. Java also has some other types of objects, like a date object. that you can use? Yeah. Oh, bigger. Yeah, sure. All right. How's that? Okay, so let's delete that. We don't need it. Save that. All right, so now we're back to our kind of our normal margins. And then the inner width and the inner height, right, there's going to be the width minus the margin dot left. So to get that margin dot left value, right, which is 160, I can say object dot value, right, and that will return 160. All right, so I say minus margin dot left minus margin dot right. And then I do the same thing for inner height. So I say height minus, oh, this is weird. All right, I say height minus margin square bracket top minus margin dot bottom. So these are two different ways to reference the values inside of a Java object, a JavaScript object. So I can either open a bracket and put the name of the value in as a string, or I can say dot name of the thing. Okay, so one reason that this type of reference, right? So why would I want to do this? Like, why would I ever want to do this why couldn't I just say like margin dot whatever? So one reason I might want to do that is, let's say I have something like, let's go back and look at this data file real quick. All right, let's say I have something called country or dependency. Okay. Go back here. Okay. So you see here, the key in this JavaScript object is it's a whole string, right, with spaces in it. So I can't really say something like this doesn't make sense. You know, I couldn't say console.log margin dot country or dependency. All right, so let me save that and try to print it. Right, it's going to cause an error in my JavaScript, and you can see that here. Right, there's like some issue happening. Okay, but if I reference it like this, okay, oops. If I do that, now it will print. Now I can reference it correctly. Okay. So that's why I might reference it using this type of using this style. Okay. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a D3 CSV call. Let's go down here and comment that. So D3 CSV does a GET request. So this is an HTTP request for some given URL. Right, so in this case, our URL is just population by country 2020 CSV. This could also be like a remote URL. It could be a hyperlink or an HTTP address. We're doing a GET request, and it's gonna, and the CSV, so the d3.csv, what that says is we expect there to be a CSV file at the location of this wherever I'm making the request, right? So I expect there to be a CSV file in the same folder as this bar HTML. And so if I go open this, right, that population by country CSV is in the same folder as the bar HTML, so it's gonna reference it. It's gonna load that file kind of into the page here. Okay. So once it's loaded, it's gonna load it into this data object. Okay, so population by country _ 2020 CSV is going to be loaded into some JavaScript object, which is actually going to be an array. And then we're going to run some code. Okay, so this right here, this arrow notation, this is what's called a JavaScript anonymous function. So it's a little like if you've done like Lisp or Scheme, kind of the same thing. And what it basically says is once we get the data, immediately run what's inside this bracket right here. So this is a function we're defining right now. And once the CSV file is fully loaded, run the code. Right. So once it's loaded, then run the code. All right. So let's go down and find where that closes. It's going to go all the way down here. Okay. So we're going to run this big anonymous function once our data is fully loaded. Now you see I have a console here, right? So we're going to print out this this data thing, right? This data thing we just loaded, and you can see here that it's right here. So this is it right here in the JavaScript console. Now, in contrast to the margin, right? This is a JavaScript object, and you can tell that in the console because, like, you see how it's got the curly brackets. This has the square brackets. Okay, so that's basically saying this is a list or an array. That's how to think of this. Right, so this is a list of 235 things. There's 235 items in here. And in the console, you can see that they break it up into chunks of 100. So 0 to 99, 100 to 199, and then the rest. So I expand that, I can see that I've got a bunch of objects. So each item in this array is a JavaScript object. And that object is composed of the keys. So these were the column headers in that CSV file, right? So if we go back to it one more time, right, country or dependency, population 2020, yearly change, right? And then all of the values are stored as values, right? So China, right, there's the population that's stored. There's the yearly change, 0.39, right? Right, and so so each item in the array, it's going to do that, right? So China was the first one loaded, then India, right? So you can see all of India's data there. Then the US, right? So this tabular data, we've loaded it into an array of a bunch of items, right? Each of our items is a JavaScript object, right? Now, you might notice, right, so one thing you might notice here is all of these values are strings, right? So population, right, you see how it's got the quotes around it, right? So when it imports it, the default is just make it a string, right? So in a minute, we're going to have to convert all these values to numbers. Okay, but first though, what we're going to do is we're going to sort this JavaScript array based on the population. Okay, and so if you remember back to Python or like Java, right? This is very similar. So we have a comparator function, and we're going to call data.sort. So for this list of items, sort them according to this function right here that we're going to define. Okay, so that function is going to take two items in our list, A and B, and it's going to check their population values. Right? And you might notice here, right? So we're referencing it using this right? This square bracket, right? Because the population has a space in it. So we can't say like B dot. So we have to use that square bracket approach. And the other thing we're doing is we're casting the values from numbers or from strings to numbers. Right? So each object we have a plus sign, right, to convert it from a string to a number. Right, and this comparator is just gonna, right, that'll sort the items using a comparator sort. Right, and so if we wanted to go like lowest to highest, right, we could just swap A and B. All right, so we're gonna sort the data, and then we're gonna only get the first 10 items in the array. So I don't want to show all 235 or 234 countries. We'll just show 10. It's a little bit easier to see. So we can use a slice function to do this. So again, we'll say, so for our list, get, starting at the first index spot, get 10 items. So if we do that, and then we'll print out what we have, we go look at that. Right, you can see that we start out with 235 elements, and then we go down to 10. And if we swap our comparators, right, so you can see, right, it's by population. So China, India, US, right, it's going decreasing order. If we swap those and reload the page, right, now we go from Holy See, Tokelau, can't even pronounce that, Falkland Islands, Wallace and Fort. I've never heard of like any of these places. Anyone from Holy See or anywhere like that? Okay, maybe next class. I think that's the Holy See. Yeah, so isn't Vatican the smallest? I think that's Holy See. Okay, okay. Okay, next. So next we're gonna do what's called data wrangling. So data wrangling is just a fancy word to say, let's modify the data to make it easier to do stuff with. So, to sort to a database or to visualize it, right? A lot of the times real world data is not very clean. It might be really messy, right? There might be missing data values. There might be like, sometimes it might be written as a number. Sometimes it might be written as like something else. So data wrangling is just, let's kind of like make it easier to work with. We'll kind of standardize it. Okay, so what do we do? So for each, so this is like a for loop for our list. So for each item in our list, so each item, D, okay, so D is going to be the first item, and we'll go to the second one, right? So it's each item. We're going to call an anonymous function. Right, so anonymous function right here, this right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to convert, well, we're going to take the population value, convert it to a number, and store it as a new value in our item called population. Then we'll do the same thing for country. So for country, we're going to take country dependency, and we're just going to save it to a new attribute just called country, like one word, without any space. So let me save this. So if we go look at it again, right, you can see that now, let's see, where did it go? Did it go in there? Save. Oh yeah, oh, thank you, yeah. Yeah, so you can see now we have two new attributes, right? One is the population in as a number, right? Not as a string, and then we just have dot country. So this just makes it a little bit easier to reference down below. Okay, next. All right, let's actually get into visualizing this data. So to do the visualization, the first thing we're going to do is create some scales, right, for our chart. Right, so a bar chart, right, you lay out bars along some common scale. The length of the bar indicates the the value, right? Some numeric value. So here, we're going to create an X scale and a Y scale. So we're going to lay out our bar chart horizontally, right? So normally a bar chart, the bars go up. This one, we're going to go left to right. So our X scale is going to show right. It's going to show the bars. The size of the bar indicates the population along a linear scale, right? So longer bar is linearly more than a shorter bar. For the vertical slots, right? For each country gets one slot. For this, we can use what's called a band scale. Okay. Now, if you want to know more about those, right, there's links to the documentation here too. Okay, so for our horizontal scale, right, this is going to show the length of the bars. We say d3.scale linear. Oops. And then there's two properties that we're going to give this linear scale. We're going to say dot domain and then dot range. Okay, so domain is the data space of our scale. And the range is the pixel space. So what do we mean by that? Right, so there's kind of two things that we're doing with the scale here. We have some data attribute, right, which has some minimum and maximum, right? A minimum population for our bar chart and a maximum population for our bar chart. Okay, and right, if we go look at that, let's go look at what that is. Right, so Holy See has 800 people, right? And then Wallace and Futuna has a little over 11,000 people. So our data space is going to go from 800, or whatever we define as the minimum, to like a little over 11,000. And so you can see here that what we're actually doing is we're not starting at 800. We're going to start our minimum at 0. So this bar is going to go from 0 to whatever the maximum of our current set of countries is. Right, so we say dot domain is going to go from, our data is going to go from 0 to whatever the max of our list of countries is. So D3 max, and we say function D, return D dot population. Okay. So this is another way to say, so what this is going to do is it's going to iterate, it's going to loop through our list, through our data list, and for each item, look at the population value, and then just save whatever the max is and return that. Okay, so this d3.max function is going to return 11,276. Okay. So our data space is going to go from 0 to 11,286. Right. So that's our data space that we want our scale to go across. Our range is the pixel space. Our pixel space is going to go from some 0 to whatever the width of our chart is. Okay, so if you remember, that inner width is the width of our SVG, right? The width of the SVG minus our left and right margins. So 600 minus margin dot left is 160. 600 minus 160 minus 20. So that's what 420, right? So it's going to be from 0 to 420. So we're going to translate, right? We have some scale that goes from 0 to a little over 11,000. Right? Items will fall somewhere inside that scale. And what the scale linear is going to do is going to translate that down to 0 to 420. It's going to make it smaller. Going to fit it into our pixel space. So that's how the scale linear works. A band scale is what we use for categorical data. Right? So each country gets its own bar. Right? So you can think of each country being its own category for each item. So we'll say .domain data.map. So what that map is going to do is it's going to say, give me a list of items. And the list of items will be based on the countries. Okay, so we have our list of there's 10 countries in our data list right now. So give me a set of like 10 slots that we can distribute data across. Right? If the data maps to the to China, if that's the country, so this says, okay, so go find the China slot, and we're going to map data at that point. And then the range here, again, so just like for our X scale, for our scale linear, right? We need to map this in some pixel space on our browser window. So go from 0 to whatever the height of the chart is. And this padding, I'll show you in a second what that does. We'll come back to the padding in a second. All right, the next thing we're going to do, append a G element that's offset by the top and left margins. And the commented outline is how to do this using string literals. Okay. So we're going to say const G equals SVG append G. ATTR, or attribute, transform, translate. Actually, this should say this is wrong. This is actually backwards. This is the way to do it with string literals. I have that commented out backwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to append a G element to our DOM, so it'll show up in our Chrome, and we're going to move that from the top left, from the 0, 0 position, to a little bit inside. So we're going to move it whatever the left is, the margin dot left, so 20 or 160, and whatever the margin top is. That was 20 pixels. Right? So we don't see it, right? So we appended some element called G to our page. That's what this line is going to do. But it doesn't actually show up in our browser. Now, if we go into the DevTools and look for it, we actually see it. Right? So there's an element that we just added to the page, G. And we moved that G from the top left, from the 0, 0 position, a little bit to the left and a little bit down. Okay. Now you might ask, why do we have to do this weird transform thing? Why can't we say like X equals, margin dot left and Y equals margin dot top? That's how HTML does it. I wish it was different. It's a little weird. But when you append G elements, this is how you have to position it. Okay. Another way to do this is I could actually just build a string. So if we compare these, right, I could say attribute transform. You see here I say open a string, translate, plus margin dot left, close this, open up another string, add a comma, close the string, add margin dot top, add a string, close the parenthesis. Right, so I could do something like that too. That's the same code as what's commented out above. Right, just building a string like that. This way to do it right here is called a string literal. So in JavaScript, a string literal, I can start a string with a tick mark instead of a normal single or double quote. I can do a tick mark, right? It's this like that key right there, with the tilde. That's where it is on your keyboard. Right, you do the tick. And then it's just like a string, except I can say $, open bracket, and then I can I can put in the value or the variable right there, and that'll read the value when it parses that code. Okay, so these will do the same, the exact same operation. It's just that string literals can make it a little bit cleaner, right? It's a little easier to debug. But make sure you do the tick. If you do a quote, it's not going to work. Another question I get sometimes is, why use a single quote? Why not like a double quote? As far as I know, they're exactly the same. Okay, so if I said like transform using double quotes instead of single quotes, that will work. It doesn't matter. Right, you just have to, whatever you start your string with, you have to close it with the same, right? Double quote, single quote, single quote. Yeah. All right. Now let's actually draw our bars. So this line here, this is what's going to add the rectangles in our bar chart. So we say bar chart. So now we're going to make another variable called bar chart. We'll say g.select all rect dot data dot enter. So this is very important. This is kind of the key to D3. So instead of opening up like a for loop and saying, for country number 1, draw a rectangle at this position. Okay, loop. For I equals 2, get country number 2 from our array. Figure out the vertical and like horizontal position. Okay, draw it. All right, loop. For I equals 3. Right, we don't have to do that. This basically does, it's like a functional form of doing that. So again, if you've done like Scheme or Lisp, this should look familiar to you. So what it's going to do is we're going to say, for our data array, for our list of countries, okay? For each country in our list, we're going to do an enter operation. So enter means insert or append. So we want to add it to the screen. We want to enter it onto the screen. So for each item in our list, draw it. We're going to draw it as a rectangle. So for each item in our list, we're going to draw one rectangle. The vertical position of that rectangle is based on the Y scale, this band scale that we created. Okay. So inside this enter, you can think of it like a for loop. So each data point in our list will run this block of code. Okay, so it's going to append a rectangle, and then it's going to say, okay, so we're going to add some Y attribute, right? Find the vertical position of the rectangle. And that's going to be based on the Y scale of the country, right? So whatever the country is, that Y scale, that band scale, we'll stick it in some vertical bucket, okay? And so this D here, that's going to reference each country, like as this is, you can kind of think of this like a loop, right? This is going to be the current item in the loop, this D. It's just a reference to that. So we'll say for that D, call the Y scale based on whatever my country is, right? So I could be China, I could be Holy See, I could be, you know, whatever I am in the list. And I'm going to do the same thing for the width of the rectangle. So the width for my item is based on the X scale, right? That linear scale based on the population. Now there's a lot going on here. Like I'm showing you a couple of different ways to do this, to make these calls. So one way to do it is with an anonymous function, right? So I have the equal sign and the greater than sign. So that says call an anonymous function. And that anonymous function is just gonna call our scale. And that's going to return some pixel number, some number that I'm going to set as the y of the rectangle. Another way to do this is I can say function d. So function d says, so for the current country in the list, d, let's do some function. And that function is going to return whatever the scale gives me for the population. So let me save this real quick and we can draw it real quick. All right, so save. Okay. All right, so here's our list of 10 countries. We've drawn 10 rectangles, 1 rectangle for each country. The y position is based off of this line right here. Right, so the scale band is going to stick it in some vertical bucket. The width of the rectangle is based on the x scale that we define, that linear scale, which is going to map 0 to 11,000 population to 0 to whatever the inner width is, like 420, right? Now, why is it drawing right here and not in the top left? Well, it's because the x scale, let's see here. All right, sorry, it's because we're drawing on this G element. Okay, that G element that we shifted over. So that's going to basically let us use that top left corner of that top bar there. That's our new 0, 0 point that we're drawing off of. If we were drawing directly on the SVG, so if we replace this G with SVG, right, like that, and then save that, you see it'll shift to the upper left. Right, and we can see that in the DevTools too. So you see we have a G element, and then we've appended a bunch of rectangles, one rectangle for each country, but they're not children of our G element. If we do it like this, we say G, and then save that, right? You see now the rectangles are underneath the G element. Okay, so it's using that G's position as its frame of reference. Okay. Right, so because it's nested, it can use that as the 0, 0 point. Okay, so that's actually quite nice, right? Because we're going to draw rectangles, we're going to draw some axes, some labels, right? We don't have to do a bunch of complicated math every single time. We can just use our G as kind of an anchor position for the rest of our chart. Okay, now, I haven't talked about this yet, this G.SelectAll. So this is interesting because when I get to this line of code right here, the only thing that's on the SVG is this G element, right? So if I comment this back out, okay, and inspect, right? The only thing here is a G, this G element. So I say G.SelectAllRect, okay? G.SelectAllRect. That's going to be an empty selection. Like that selection is, there's nothing in the document object model called rect. There's no rect elements. So it's going to say, oh, this selection is empty. That's exactly what we want to do. We're going to have an empty selection, and then we're going to bind some data to it and say, okay, if this data doesn't exist in our selection, we want to insert it or draw it on the page. Okay, so this gets really important later when we look at dynamic charts, right, where a chart might update, and we don't necessarily want to wipe the chart and redraw it. We might do a selection, there might already be data points on our chart. So this select all might not be an empty selection. So that's when this comes more into play. Right now, though, because it's empty, what we do is we say, okay, this data, let's add it, right? There's an empty selection, we have data, let's add the data. And we're going to draw it as rectangles. Okay. All right, save this again, reload it. Now, having the rectangles touch, I don't really like that. So that's what that padding line does. So in the scale band, it's padding dot 0.1. If I save that again, right, so we'll just add a little bit of padding on our bars. Okay. Now, let's add an x-axis and a y-axis. So we'll do the x-axis, we'll do the y-axis first. So save this and run it. So y-axis equals D3 axis left. So axis left is a D3 function. So just like it says, right? We want to add an axis to the left side of our chart based on our y scale. Okay. And then we'll say g dot append, g dot call y-axis. So this is the code you use to append that to the page. And you notice here, right, it kind of did everything for you. It wrote a bunch of text, right? And then there's a vertical black line and a bunch of tick marks. So if we go look at that in the document object model, right? So we see all the rectangles that we added, go all the way down. You can see that there's a bunch of other things that got added, right? A bunch of ticks with lines and strokes, and then so all of that was added with this call here. Yes.
Have the choice of not how to stick with how we take y and x.
Okay, so the question is, do we have the choice of not including a tick? Great question. Stick around for the fancy bar chart page in about 2 minutes. Yeah. I think it's there. Yeah. Next, okay, so then we'll do the x-axis. So this is a slightly more complicated. So you say D3, so the x-axis, we want a bottom axis, right? So we're gonna stick it on the bottom of our chart. So we're gonna call the x-axis, but you notice here, we have this transform, this transform code here, which is going to shift it from the top of our chart to the bottom of the chart. So if I comment this out and reload the page, right, you see how even though it's a bottom axis, that's just going to stick the labels and the tick marks at the bottom. We still have to actually shift the axis down properly. So that's what this transform translate does. Okay. And you can see here, we only need to shift it vertically. Like we don't need to do the margin left, the margin top, and the chart height. We only need to do it, inner height down. That's because we're appending it to our G element. And we're not appending it to the SVG. If we did it to the SVG, again, if we did something like that and saved it, right, you can see it's not quite in the proper position. So it's all nested, right? So that G element acts as an anchor, so it's easier to position. Okay. Okay. And then the last thing, oh, sorry, almost last thing. The other thing here, so this text here, so this will rotate the text. So there's a couple of stylistic things that we're doing. We changed the text anchor to right aligned. We're going to slightly shift the text down 10 pixels. And then we rotate it. So if you don't do that, if this is commented out, right, you can see the text just goes across. So that could be a big issue. If we don't do the smallest countries, it's not too big of a deal. But let's go back to the biggest countries. So BNA, right? So if we do the biggest countries, right, China, India, US, right, you can see that we're going up to 1.4 billion people. If we don't rotate the code, rotate the axis labels, right, you can see that they start overlapping. Now, an interesting thing here is we have a reference to this G, right? This G element that's going to exist right about there. So we add this axis to it, right? And that's going to add all of this stuff here. as we add it, we can also do a selection on it. So this is going to say, within our axis, like inside our axis content, inside the document object model. So within we're going to add the axis right here, right? So that's the axis that we're adding. So within that, we want to select all of the text elements. Okay, so you can see here, so inside here, there's path elements, there's G elements, and there's line elements, and there's text elements. Okay, so this select all text, this is gonna be a not empty selection. It's gonna say, okay, there's some existing content inside our document object model that's gonna return. So we have a reference to a bunch of things on our page, right? Basically all of these labels, okay? For each of those items, modify them according to these properties right here, right? Adjust their alignment, shift them a little bit, and rotate them, okay? Now you might notice it's only the items in our selection, right? Only these things were included in the selection because that selection is based on the axis that we just added. Like these labels right here did not get selected. But if we did something like G dot select all, right? Let's say we did it like this. Okay, we said G dot select all text. That would include these two, right? Because they're kind of nested inside the G. So if I save that, right now you can see that everything gets shifted. So that's not what we want. All right, so keep in mind, the DOM is a tree, and we can use that to our advantage in doing these sorts of selections. All right, so if we only want to select a subset of stuff, then we'll just, we'll localize our selection to that part of the document object model. Okay. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do here is we'll add some axis labels. And to do that, we'll just add some text. So we'll say gappend, add a text element with a bunch of properties. So for the countries, right, we want that to be over a little bit. Let's do 140, that's too much. We'll say maybe 100 or maybe 80, right? Right, and so we'll rotate it a little bit and we'll position it, we'll move it around, make it middle aligned, and then the text itself will say country. And then for this population label, we'll just add another text label like that to the bottom, okay? So this is our bar chart that we built, right? That shows the population counts for a set of 10 countries. Okay, now let's, so you asked about, basically, do we have to visualize it this way? Well, no, we don't. So let's make it look a little bit fancier. Okay, so this fancy bar HTML, this code looks very similar. Okay, so you can see we've got this big block of code here. Let me just open this, save that, and open with live server. Okay. This code looks very similar. There's a couple of differences, but in general, it's about the same. So the first 10 items are actually identical, right? We have our bar chart SVG. We're going to get a reference to the SVG. We're going to make a margin. We're going to load our data. We're going to do some sorting and slicing and data wrangling. We're going to make an X and a Y scale. We'll add a G element. And then we'll draw the bars on the page. Okay, so all of that is the same. I think the only difference is I made the margins a little bit different. Yeah, I think these are just a little bit different. Now, we're going to make this look a little bit fancier. We're going to add a little bit of extra styling. So for the y-axis, let's get rid of the tick marks. And you can actually see that we're already doing this. Right, so here we have these little tick marks for each country. Maybe we don't need those on a bar chart, right? Because the labels are right there. The bars themselves are thick enough to see. So the way we do that is we say, we append our y-axis, right? So this code is exactly the same as the previous one. But we'll do another selection. We'll say dot select all domain and tick line dot remove. So what's that going to do? So we're going to create our y-axis and then immediately select that part of the DOM. And specifically within that part of the DOM, select all of the elements that have a class domain or a class tick that are aligned. And we'll just say remove. So that will remove those tick marks right there. And you can verify that if you go look in the DOM. If we go look here, and you can see there's these right here. Inside there's a text. If we go look at the previous example, we go look at that. And you can see here that there's both text and a line. Okay, so that tick line is going to remove that. Okay. The other thing you might see here is there's a should be a line somewhere that with a domain class that got removed somewhere in there. Okay, so it's going to remove that. For the x-axis, there's a couple things we're going to do. The first one is, if you notice here on our simple bar chart example, we just spell out the entire number, right? 0, 200 million, 400 million, 600 million, right? It gets really big really fast. So we can use a string formatter to make this look a little bit nicer, right? And get a result like this. So the way we do that is we can define a tick format function and say if we give it some string, some variable, apply a string formatter like this. So I'm not going to go into details on this, but there's a really nice D3 block that kind of explains how to do this, right? You can do a format. So I'm going to say something like 1.4 billion. All right, so 1.4 billion. I could say .3s. Yes, I could do something like that. And give me that, and I could just not 140 million. Like that. And it gives me this 1.4 G. So G is the scientific notation for billion, but I don't like that. I just want to use B because that makes more sense to me. So we'll also replace that with a string replace, right? And that will convert this 1.4 or 14000, right? It'll just convert that to a much nicer looking 1.4B, 1.4B. So that's one change we're going to make. Another thing we're going to do is instead of, right, you see how we add a domain line here and then there's these little bitty tick marks. We're going to do these vertical tick marks that go the entire way up. So we're going to do this with a combination of D3 and CSS. So let me first uncomment this, save it. Okay. Go back down. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll apply this tick format when we draw our x-axis at the bottom, right? We'll do this tick format using this tick format function we just defined, right? So that will convert our axis labels from, from the raw numbers to the more nicely formatted numbers. Okay, so that's the first thing we do. The next thing we do is we're gonna kind of take advantage of this tick size property. So the size of the ticks, right? The default size of the ticks looks like that, right? This here. So I don't know, it's like 5 or 10 pixels wide. We're gonna say the height of the ticks is equal to negative inner height. So the size of the tick is the height of the chart, but actually go in the negative direction. Okay, so if without the negative, you see they go like off the page. Minus inner height, they're just gonna go up instead. And then we're gonna use CSS to change the color from a black color to a light gray color. And same thing with the text, from a black color to a light gray color. Okay. Now you might notice that also is going to affect these labels right here on the side. So all of the tick text on the page will turn this, a little bit nicer gray color instead of a black. And then the last thing we're going to do is instead of adding a y-axis label like this, we just add we'll just put a title on top of the chart, right? That way we don't need an axis label like that. So to do that, instead of, we append the population label on the bottom, but instead of appending a label on the top, on the side, we'll just put a title at the top. Okay. And then there's a little bit of CSS up at the top to make this not black text, but again, it'll make it a gray text, so it just fits in with the theme of our chart a little bit better, like that. And so we have this title class that we give it right here, this title class.